Hello everyone. I'm going to get into some 3D motion tracking now, and I just want to show you the finished clip. So it's pretty cool. It's taking the animated logo from the first class and placing it on the table using 3D motion tracking. And I'll show you what the process is right now with getting the track done through After Effects, which is pretty easy compared to how it was done with 2D motion tracking on the phones. Yeah, this process is a little bit easier because you don't have to worry about tracking points. You just need to make sure that the shot itself is pretty solid. I'll explain some of the pitfalls of taking shots into the 3D camera tracker and what to avoid. But I'm going to start with this one. And this is the complete shot that I took all of this from. So it's just a cell phone video. One of the things that is helping this shot really well is that this table itself is not a reflective surface. It's a little bit reflective like this, but it's not like a mirror or anything, and it's not like water, because if there was any kind of like reflective surface up here like this, it would show the ceiling or any other parts of the room, and After Effects would think that that's part of the table, and it would mess up the motion track. So, and also another thing that's great about this shot is that this table itself has a lot of texture. So just like the 2D motion tracking tracker, it needs some contrast and color changes and luminance changes in the shot in order to see to track the pixels along. So this table is actually really helping the motion track because of all the really fine detail and texture on it. And another thing that's important about this shot is that there's no one in it. There's no one walking around or obstructing the camera in any way. And if there was someone, like say there was someone walking over in the background right here, After Effects would actually, track that because it's part of the shot, and you'd have to go through and delete the tracking points that went on the person, which is not a big deal, but it helps make the track a lot more robust when there's nothing really adding or distracting After Effects with the track. Like, it's an empty room, there's no movement going on in this room at all, it's just the camera moving, and so it can really just focus on what it needs to track, and you don't have to worry about any distractions or poor surfaces. There's no reflections, there's no movement going on in the scene except for what the camera's doing. So it's a really good shot for motion tracking. And the first thing you do, I'm gonna just go here. So I ended up cutting the shot down to this, just coming around the table. And that's it's a nice thing to do. So I just did this shot. I just cut it down to this part. I think it's a nice shot. It's showing the camera track. It's not very long. It's only 8.5 seconds or so. So it won't be very intense to track. It won't take that long for After Effects to figure out. I think it's kind of cool to walk around the edge of the table too, to show that part. So once again, here's the final shot. And all I did was I imported the After Effects project of the animated logo. So I'll show you what I did real quick. And you can just go into the project folder and double click to import. And instead of bringing in a video of the finished logo, you can actually go into your After Effects project and import the actual project. And you can see how it says import as project. So if I import and bring it in, it comes in as a folder, the entire AEP. And then it has the compositions and the stuff that was imported in that project. So in this project, it was Illustrator file all set out into different layers. I was able to just open up this composition of the finished animation inside the new project, and then I just dropped in this composition into the scene. And it's a nice, I'll show you the process too. It's actually really easy to deal with other After Effects projects inside an After Effects project, because the thing that's kind of annoying about After Effects is you can't open different projects at the same time. You can only open one project at one time. So if you wanted to switch between projects and copy and paste other compositions or other elements from different projects that you have, the only way to do that is to import that project into your open project. After Effects at the same time makes it really easy to do that. And so that's all that this composition is just an imported After Effects project, and I just dropped that composition in and I made it 3D. And that process obviously I'll come to in a little bit, but I just wanted to show you how easy that ends up being. So let's get started with the track. So once you have, make sure that the shot is exactly as long as you need it to be. And there's no extra footage in the shot because it's just going to take more time to track and you're not going to end up using it. So tracking really is one of the last things you do. Just make sure you have your shot finished and it's the exact length is what you need before you start tracking, just because you're going to need to do a lot of kind of detail work on that shot. So it's not really worth having a shot that is going to get cut down or changed before you start tracking. Or I'm sorry, after you start tracking. Anyway, so I cut the shot down a little over 8 seconds. I'm just going to select a layer like that, and in the tracker panel, instead of doing track motion like we did for the cell phone, we just do this other button called track camera. And right as you push that button and you have that layer selected, it automatically starts analyzing the shot. And what that means, analyzing in background, is if you had other things going on, you can actually still work while it's analyzing. So you can go back to a different composition, you can start animating something else or doing other work while it's still analyzing, which is nice, so it doesn't lock up your system. And another thing that's important to note is I didn't go into a layer to do this like you would with the track motion part, the motion tracking. You don't have to do that. You do it inside of the composition. And obviously it'll tell you that if you try to go into a layer and use track camera. So right now I went back and it's solving the camera is the last thing it does. What that means is it throws a bunch of points up and it tracks where those points go in the shot, and then from those points it actually creates a digital camera inside After Effects that does the exact same motion as what the video shot did, or at least a very, very close approximation. So these points are floating and they're connected to the table and other parts of the scene. These are all just automatically done in After Effects. I don't have to do anything to add these points. And it's nice to see that, and you're going to have to go through the shot and make sure that there's no points that end up floating in the scene. And there are actually a couple points that are doing that, and that's going to end up confusing After Effects and making for a really shaky camera solve. So what that means is there's points that are moving in here, and After Effects thinks that they're correct, and that'll go into the camera solve, that information, and it's not going to be accurate, and you're going to get these very tiny shakes in the shot because it won't be the exact match of the actual video shot. So we can go through and just really kind of prune out the points that are going to confuse After Effects. I can see a couple right now, and actually a lot of it, this is good to see. So a lot of it And I'm gonna check this box right here called render track points. You turn that on, even when the effect is not selected, you'll see the points, and you can actually play back and they'll stay on. So it's good to see. You can do that and watch the shot back and forth and see how the points behave. I see one. Okay, so it's a little bit hard to see, but there's this blue point right here. I'm just gonna zoom in. It's all pixelated, but so it's right here. If you watch this point as I go back and forth, it's actually moving. What it's doing is it's actually tracking the reflection of the bookcase on the table, and that's bad. That's going to lead to a shaky camera track, because you can see the other points. These ones right here and these ones over here, they're moving they're moving on the table. They're not sliding around at all. Whereas these two points right here are moving on the table. And that's exactly what you don't want. And that's a reflection. So if there's like a puddle of water on this table and it was reflecting perfectly like the bookshelf back here, After Effects would track that bookshelf through the reflection, and that would end up confusing. It wouldn't confuse After Effects. It would just lead to an inaccurate camera solve. And so it's important to go through this shot, and really there's actually a lot over here too, and see those points that are moving. I'm trying to think if there's other parts of this shot that are. There's a C one right here. Watch this one. So it kind of slides around. This one right here is moving. And that's why this table is so useful, because there's so many little fine variations in texture on the cement After Effects can really latch onto and track. It's going to add to a really nice camera solve. But first, these have to be pared down. The ones that like over here too, that are sliding along the table. And so I'm going to, what you need to do is just select the layer and then make sure that the effect is actually highlighted in effect controls, and this is going to show up, and we'll get to that in a second. That's really helpful. But this is how you can end up selecting points like that. As long as this is selected and you're seeing the bullseye, you can select these points and delete them. And so I'm just going to select that one. I'm going to shift select this one and this one, and then just hit delete. And it's going to resolve. See how I'm scrubbing and it gets really pixelated, and then it clears up when you stop. What's happening here is it's called adaptive resolution. So in order for After Effects to be as fast as you want it to be when you're scrubbing like this, it has to change the resolution to perform better. Or at least that's a setting that it has by default. And just so you know, if you want to turn that off, it's right here in this lightning bolt icon. It's set to adaptive resolution by default, and you can turn it off so it stays at final quality no matter what you're doing, which is obviously going to slow your system down if there's a lot going on. But for me personally, it's just kind of annoying for stuff like this, especially, to have to deal with this pixelation for performance type thing. So I just like to know this can be turned off when you want it to. There's also fast draft, which you can't really see here, but it's just kind of it's not pixelated, but it's not as smooth either. So there's different options, and I just like for this kind of stuff, I want to keep it off so I can see the final quality as I scrub through all the time. There's one right there. Okay, it's a good starting point. I like it. And now what's nice is we can start placing objects in 3D in this scene. And the first thing to do to get that is to add a shadow catcher, is what they call it. And what that is just it's a plane, it's an object that lays flat, and it doesn't show up in the scene, but it will cast shadows. It will receive shadows cast by lights that you put in the scene. So you can't really see it in here immediately because I've laid the logo exactly on the shadow catcher plane. But if I move this logo up like that, now what a shadow catcher is it's just a shadow catcher is just it's an object in the scene that's invisible, but when there are lights placed in the scene that are inside After Effects, they'll cast a shadow, and it mimics that look of a table or a flat surface accepting or having shadows cast onto it from a light source. And I have it turned off right now, or I've placed this comp of the logo exactly on the shadow catcher, so the shadows aren't being they're still being cast, but they're not being seen. So if I move this comp up, you'll see what I mean. So that's very cool. And it's actually a solid, which is what it's called, or it's a plane that you can set to sit exactly on the table based on the tracking points of the table. And it gives you a great frame of reference to know where this object actually is in 3D space and how it interacts with the shot, the video shot that it's supposedly a part of. And so the shadow catcher is really, really helpful and just gives it that nice little kind of extra polish and realism and awesomeness that you want without a lot of work. And so I'm going to show you how to do that. So the thing that's important is, so get to a point like in this shot, especially right here, because I want a plane object, which is just a flat surface. I want it to basically be the same size or similar size to this section of the table where we're going to put the logo. And that's where this bullseye comes in. And it's trying to, it gives an approximation of, it thinks like, okay, this point is flat, so this will be like part of the table, but it's guessing. So you have to tell it exactly what you need. And the way to do that is I'm going to select a point here, I'm going to select a point here, over on this corner, and then over on that corner far away. And so you can see now that I've shift selected these points, it makes a square and it looks a lot like, it looks like in the perspective of the table, and that bullseye sits right there. So when you have this selection made like this, and all I'm doing right now is, once this is highlighted as an effect and you get that bullseye icon like this, you can just shift select the points that you want to make a plane object. Start over. So one more time, like I'm just shift selecting these points, and I want it to be like spread out, so you end up getting a good area to have a shadow catcher, so you can use a lot of this table if you want to. So I've got this selected. This is square. Here's a triangle. Here's the target. You just right click on that square, and you have this right here. Create shadow catcher, camera, and light. Now, what I haven't done yet, which I could do right there, is I haven't made a camera. And now that the camera has been solved and we've pruned out the points that don't work, if I push this button, this happens. So After Effects has created a digital camera right here that mimics the cell phone video that it was tracked from. And that's when the fun stuff starts to happen. So now that the camera is made, I can go forward again and make sure that this effect is selected on the layer, and we'll make a shadow catcher. Just like that. Right click, create shadow catcher and light. Now you don't see that much going on, but what it's done it's actually made a 3D solid. It's made a solid that's been turned into 3D, and this is what this switch means right here. When this is turned on, it allows this layer to be manipulated in 3 dimensions. So the way you get that, I'll show you. So what it's done is, if I just went into layer and made a new solid, and I just made it red, I did this. This is what happens when you make a new solid. It's a shape. It's a layer that's a certain color, and it's the exact size of the composition. And so by default, you've got that. Like, this is what happens when you make a solid, and it's not 3D yet. It won't move in the scene at all until this switch is turned on. This goes for any layer except for a light and a camera. It won't behave in 3 dimensions until you turn this layer on. So if I turn this on, look what happens. Not much right now, but if I move the scene, look at that. So it's actually floating in 3D space based off of the movement of the cell phone video. And this is because After Effects has created a camera that is basically copying this movement. And because this camera is in the scene, any object that is turned into 3D by this switch will live inside a 3D world and move around, because we're looking through this 3D tracker camera. So it's pretty amazing what you can do. And so what the shadow catcher is basically just it's this solid, but it's laid flat on a table based on the points that you selected from the tracking. So the solid is laid flat like this on the table, and you can see how it moves exactly with the camera. And so let's drop something in the scene that we can see and sort of figure out how this stuff actually works. So what I like to do is just go to the text tool and write some text. Now, just like the solid that was dropped in, this won't do anything in 3D until that switch is turned on. So right here, so I turn the switch on, nothing really changes right now until I start moving. And you can see now it's living inside that basement, basically. It's a pretty good track too. And that's the nice thing about this shot that I like, is it's kind of walking around the table. So it gives you a side view and a front view of this table. And by doing that, it gives you a good idea of where these objects are actually placed in this 3D world. Because once again, if I turn this is all just, it's a magic trick basically. Because if I turn this layer off of the video, it's still going to be moving. It just happens to be moving exactly with the video shot. And that's because this 3D tracker camera is in the scene. And these objects are turned into 3D objects. That's how it works. So it just so happens that it looks great only because this cell phone video shot is right here. But what's important is, so I can see it. This looks nice. Like, you know, looking at it straight on, it looks like it might be over the table. But only when you move to the side do you see it's actually kind of over the chair, or like over the corner of this table right here, as you place it with your eye based on the rotation of the shot. You know, the rotation around the table, basically, of the video shot. So when objects are 3D in After Effects, you get this arrow, these 3 arrows for each dimension that's inside After Effects, X, Y, and Z. So X is the flat one, it's the red one that goes this way. Y goes up, and then Z goes toward or away from the camera. That's the 3rd dimension. And so the best way to navigate, the best way to place things in 3D space in After Effects is not really to, if I go to the move tool and if I just do this and drag it around, you really can't do that much with it. You can only drag in the X and Y directions. You can't move it away from the camera by dragging. So I like to use the arrows the most, these 3 arrows, to move things around. And you can see how that mouse changes when you're over those arrows. So that means if I do this right now, I'm only moving it in the Y direction, because that Y shows up next to the cursor. Same with the X direction. When that shows up and I do that, it only moves in the X direction. And so same thing with the Z direction. Like that, I can move this forward and backward in the scene. And you can see how it does that only when you kind of move around the scene. So now it's actually starting to look like it's in the scene. It's over the table at least. And you can tell, kind of get a rough placement of it by the way you go back and forth from the front to the side view of that table. So it gives you a nice idea of where it actually lives in 3D space. And also, just don't mess with the shadow catcher. All I would really do is just scale it so it fills up the whole table like that. And then from there, like if I dragged it, then you've lost the magic trick is lost, because it's not living on top of the table anymore. It's living somewhere else. And that'll make sense in a second. So what I like to do actually is just to lock the shadow catcher by using this lock icon right here. And so now it can't be moved around at all. I can't even select it in the timeline. So it's nice. So it won't accidentally be moved around. But also right now, obviously, this text, even though it's 3D, is not casting shadows on the shadow catcher. And that's something that goes into some extra features that get revealed on 3D layers that don't exist on 2D layers. And one of them right away is this new drop-down called Material Options. See, now if I turned off the 3D switch, it goes away, and it just becomes a normal 2D layer, which is the normal transform parameters. And just because this is a text layer, it's got its own kind of drop down. but it doesn't have any of the other 3D objects. So if I hit this switch again, you can see actually the transform parameters change as well. There's an orientation, and there's a X, Y, and Z rotation added to everything in this layer because it's 3D. And then and the other thing that's been added is material options. Now, by default, when you go into material options, what this is it talks about, does this object cast shadows? How is the light? Is it like semi-transparent? Like that's what light transmission means. Does it accept shadows from other objects? Does it allow itself to be lit by lights in the scene? And then it has all these kind of other various material settings, like specular intensity is like how shiny is this object? Is it like metal? Is it like ambient or diffuse, kind of like plastic? Does it not really have a reflectivity or anything? So these are options you can mess with to give it material characteristics, but we don't have to worry about that right now. The only thing you have to really worry about is this setting right here, cast shadows. So by default, it's set to off, which means it won't cast any shadows from lights in the scene onto a shadow catcher. So just turn that from off to on, and immediately you see these shadows are being cast onto the shadow catcher. And it's really cool because you can see the shadow catcher, because we set the points correctly on the table, it sits exactly on the table. So it looks like this thing is casting shadows on the table. Now, obviously, it's not realistic right now. There's some random direct light from behind the camera, basically, casting this shadow, and it doesn't have the same characteristics of other shadows or the general lighting setup in the basement. So it looks fake, but that's not that hard to fix. It's just about getting that to that point where you can see an object casting shadows on a shadow catcher, and which is conveniently placed exactly on the table, and it moves with the camera. So this is already pretty cool in my opinion, but it's just gonna get better. Okay, so how do you move the light? Where is the light? There's that question. So by default, it dropped a light in when we made the shadow catcher. And you have also, because it's a light and it's 3D, it has light options. But the first thing is, where exactly is it? How do you find it in the scene? Because it's not immediately available, and it won't show up when you hit play. It'll only show up just like a solid when you scrub. So where is it? So if you can't find it ever, if it's off somewhere in space and you don't want to look for it, or you can't look for it, you can't find it, what I would do before really trying to dig around inside this void, basically up and around here trying to find where the light is, I would just type in 000 on the transform parameters like that. So I hit 000, so it's basically at the origin of the After Effects project, and you can see how it shows up right here. And now I can use the arrows to drag it around. See, once I hit play, it disappears. So you have to make sure you can use this to scrub it. And that's great. I mean, that's the thing about this shot that I keep going back to, is having a side view and a front view of this table gives you a great perspective of how these objects are floating in 3D space. So it looks pretty straight on right now, but as you come around the table, once again, it's kind of right above the chair. And now that I see it in the scene, I can use the arrow buttons to move it around. And I'd like to just place it up in above, kind of like how the lighting is already in the basement. Okay, so I want to show you something that you shouldn't do. Once the tracking's done, say like I just did, I just grabbed by accident, I grabbed the video layer and nudged it off of its center. And you can see how there's an edge right here. So it's not exactly in the center anymore. If I was going to go back and mess around with the 3D camera tracking and I selected this effect, this will show up. Now what it's saying is either the layer size needs to match the composition, which means the video size of this video layer needs to be the same size as the composition, the same frame size. And this, in this case, is a 1920 by 1080 video instead of a 1920 by 1080 composition, which is what you want. So it's got to say the layer has to match the comp size, or it has to use the default transform values, which means that it can't be moved off of its center of its default settings, which is whatever it is when you first drop a layer in. And so what I did by accident is I grabbed the layer and moved it off of its like default center, its default transform value. And so now if I go back to this, it'll just give you this, and it'll be really annoying. So just make sure if you nudge this off of its center, the video layer that you did the track from, you go into the transform parameters for that layer, and you can just hit reset. And it'll go back to its default transform values, and the banner will disappear. So all it's saying is, hey, the video it's not centered anymore off of its defaults. It's going to mess up the 3D camera track. So once again, just like I had locked out the shadow catcher, just use that lock key, that lock icon, to lock the video layer. So then you don't accidentally nudge it or move it or anything. It's really nice. And then you're not going to get that banner or anything. Okay. So I want this shadow to be less intense and softer. And you can see right here is the light icon, where that light's coming from. And so what I'm going to do first is actually change this text. I'm going to rotate this text to lay flat on the table, and a little bit raised off of the table too. And the first thing to do, the way to do that is I can use the X rotation, which means it's rotating along this axis, the X axis. And if I go into that and drag it like that, really to be -90, so it's laying flat exactly on the table. That's funny because that actually looks a little bit, it's not exactly at 90. So I'm just going to kind of eyeball this to be, so for some reason -77 degrees is considered flat on this table. Okay, so I moved it back like that. I rotated on the x-axis about right there. I'm going to use the z-axis to rotate it this way, which means it's going to rotate on this axis, the z-axis. So it's rotating like that, just to kind of lay more on the table. And I'm just going to scale it up too, right here with the scale button, with a scale parameter. Place it like that, so it's pretty much on the table. Now what I'm going to do, just because it's text, I don't really want it to be, I don't want it to be lit by the light, but I still want the object, I still want the text layer to cast shadows. So I'm going to go into some text material options, and right here when you say accepts lights turned to on, then the light will give it, it'll behave like it's being lit by a light. If I turn this off, it still casts shadows because cast shadows is turned on, but now it's pure white. It doesn't, it's not, its color and its shading of the actual text isn't being influenced by the lights in the scene. So it's a nice, like, perfectly white text, but still in 3D and still casting shadows. It's pretty awesome. Obviously you can change any of these colors too to be what you want. So there's that too. Anyway, so I would like to change the light so that the shadows are more diffused and softer. And that comes down to you can change the type of shadow that comes out of this light in the light options of the layer. And it says right here, light options, drop down point. So a point light is basically just a light bulb. It's just a point of light that emits in all directions. And that's not exactly realistic, I think. It can be, it's useful for some things, but me personally, I would change the light options from point to spotlight. Now what that does, as you can see, is it creates a cone just like a spotlight would. And you can see this light, this shadow is already a little bit more realistic. What it's doing right now is this point right here is called the point of interest. And so you can see right here, there's two position parameters going on now with this spotlight. There's the point of interest and there's the actual position of the spotlight. And so that's nice because you can set the point of interest to be pointing down instead of having to rotate the light. You just change the point of interest. So I'm changing the point of interest right now. I'm just scrubbing down in the Y direction so that the point of interest is actually moving down to point more towards the table. Now if I move, see if I just scrub the position of the light, it moves up and everything, but it still points to that point of interest. So you've got two different coordinates to work with with this light. And I still can't really tell where it's pointing because I haven't moved the camera around. So that's nice. It's pointing pretty much above the text, but I want to actually put it pointing down more. And so I'm going to just scrub the point of interest to be pointing down like that. Now if I come around, you can see how it's basically pointing down onto the table. I can move this a little bit more. Oh, whoops. I can move the point of interest. Actually, I'll move the light itself to be more above the point of interest. That's pretty good. Okay, and then now that it's pointing straight down, I'm just going to, in the Z direction, just move it up from the scene. Great. Okay, so from here, just want to make the shadows a little bit lighter, a little bit softer. And it's a lot easier to do that with a spotlight than a point light, which is why I like to use those more. And right here, your shadow darkness is set to 100% and your diffusion is set to 0. Now, if I scrub up on the diffusion, you'll see what happens. See a little bit of a change, but if I bring the darkness down, you'll see a big difference. So I would say basically right about here, it seems like kind of a realistic amount of shadow on the table, and that's at 59% darkness, maybe like 65% darkness. Now if I really bring up this diffusion, you'll see how it gets nice and soft. That's at 594 pixels. That's almost 600 pixels. Whatever that measurement is, I'm not really sure why they call it that. But it's if you just scrub up on it, you'll see how it softens the shadows the way that you really like. And that's getting to be really nice looking. That looks pretty accurate to the lights, the type of lights that are going on in that scene to match that shadow. The shadow darkness is a good darkness, and the diffusion is a good diffusion. I think that's what makes it look pretty realistic, like it's floating there. And now, just for fun, I want to, I don't know, just move this a little bit this way, like that. That's pretty nice. I'm going to turn off the, uncheck this box right here that says render track points, so when I hit play, they won't be there anymore. That's nice. That's really nice. Okay, so now we can go from some text to a composition. Previously imported the class 1, or the first class, the animated logo reveal. So I'm just going to show you, this is the composition we're going to drag into the scene. And right now it's two-dimensional. There's no background. It's just the text, or it's just the logo. And if I drag this in to the scene, look what happens. Because it's not 3D. And I'm going to go into this composition right here and go to the composition settings up here and make this, make the duration longer than 4 seconds, so it goes for the length of the shot. I made it 14 seconds. It's too long. It doesn't matter. It's long enough for it to go to the end of the composition. So you can see how this duration changed once I went into the composition settings of this composition and made the duration longer. So now it'll last for the whole shot. Well, the composition will last for the whole shot. Let me show you what else happened. Now, because I extended the length of the composition, the duration, all of these layers have to be extended as well, which is not a huge deal. If I just select all with Command A, I can select all of them and just drag the end to go all the way to the end like that. So now if I go back, so if I hit Tab, because this composition is inside of another composition, I can actually navigate between the compositions really easily by using Tab. Okay, so here it is. Now it lasts the whole shot, but I need to make it 3D. So that's easy. I'll just go in the layer and then hit 3D. And once again, just like every other layer, it moves like that. So now I'm just going to go again back to the side view and drag this back in Z space. Now, once again, by default, it's not going to be casting shadows, so you can't tell where it actually sits on this table. So it's important to go into the material options of this layer right here and turn cast shadows on. You can see a little bit of something happening right here. And it's not going to really be that good looking until you rotate this logo or this composition like we did earlier for the text. I just gotta say, that shadow looks really nice. So I'll do the same thing I did for the text and just rotate it on the x-axis to negative 77 degrees. And you can see how when it gets closer like that, how it actually mimics how real lights work, where the shadows get sharper as the object gets closer to the object it's casting shadows onto. And that's super cool looking, I think, with the animation actually casting the shadows as it gets made. And the kind of cool part, if I rotate this back to be around like this, and I move it to be floating on the table, it's kind of cool to see how these lines, as they animate, they get close to the table and kind of, let's see. They kind of sweep down along the table. It's kind of it's a cool idea. See that right there? Let me turn the shadows on this to be darker so you can see what's happening. Oh, and you can actually go above 100% on the shadow darkness too. But I don't know, it's just kind of cool looking how the lines do that. That's cool looking. That shadow looks legit, I think. Anyway, I just like how I like watching the shadow work. I like watching how it sweeps along the line, sweeps along the bottom of the table, or like the edge of the table like that. It just gives it some realism that's, I think, just irresistible, at least in my opinion. Okay, anyway, so go back up here, and we'll just go back to negative 77. And bring that close to the table. Now, when it's done this way, it looks way too dark. So, bring this back down to 60 or so percent. And it looks more like the shadow that would be cast on the table like that. It also doesn't really interfere with the color of the text either. So now I'm going to rotate. So now it's rotated basically to lay on the table. I'll do it in the Z-axis to kind of lay along this edge of the table. And maybe like bring it up just a little bit so the shadow doesn't get so distracting. Maybe like that. Bring it down this way and scale it up a little bit. There we go. So, okay, one more thing, because it's moved around the table, obviously it's not centered, so put it right in the middle of the table like this, and that should be it. There you go. That is 3D camera tracking in After Effects with a little bit of shadow catcher and a little bit of light work and just kind of a little diet taste of 3D in After Effects. You can get a pretty amazing setup pretty quickly, and it's, for me personally, it's one of my favorite things you can do with 3D in general in After Effects or for Cinema 4D. But taking a video shot, motion tracking it, and then placing objects in there that shouldn't be in there and don't look like they could exist in there, but they do. That's my favorite thing. And so I hope this helps you out. In some of the stuff you could do with this is augmented reality, mock-ups. That's a big thing you could do. You could show what an app would do with an AR component in a great mock-up to communicate the idea. And I think that's something that's really powerful. So I hope this is helpful, and thanks a lot.